There's so much I need from the Lord. Things are happening all around me. I can't stand these storms. But as I look to you, you're the one who can see me through. Lord, do it again for me. Lord, my Lord. Lord, do it. Lord, do my whole life fell apart. I was in despair, hopelessly living in my pain. I didn't think no one cared.
We're now in the hands of Pastor Brown. Here you go.
We reverence God and thank Him for one more day, one more opportunity to come together. We thank Him for His word and His guidance and His directions for His church, both past and present. Thank Him for each of you who have joined us tonight as we prepare for our Sunday school lesson for this Sunday that's coming, as has already been stated. And thank you, Sister Pam, for leading us in our opening. It is for March 23rd, which is the fourth Sunday. It's lesson 4, and we're talking about offering a sweet aroma to God. And we're dealing with Old Testament teachings about the offering up that the priest made. The priesthood was established, and we saw the procedures basically last week in our lesson. And today we're talking about the offering up of sacrifices. And so the priestly order was given the responsibility to not just offer up sacrifices, but to properly offer up sacrifices. Let's read verses 3 through 17 of Leviticus chapter 1. By the way, the name Leviticus means for Levi, or it's a guide for the Levites. And so that's exactly what you're giving guidance. And tonight we happen to be dealing with burnt offering. And we'll mention the other offerings that they were expected, required to make on behalf of the people. Verse 3, King James Version. If his offering be a burnt sacrifice of the herd, let him offer a male without blemish. He shall offer it of his own voluntary will at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation before the Lord. And he shall put his hand upon the head of the burnt offering, and it shall be accepted for him to make atonement for him. And he shall kill the bullock before the Lord, and the priest Aaron's sons shall bring the blood and sprinkle the blood round about upon the altar that is by the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. And he shall flay the burnt offering and cut it into his pieces. And the sons of Aaron the priest shall put fire upon the altar and lay the wood in order upon the fire. And the priests, Aaron's sons, shall lay the parts, the head, and the fat in order upon the wood that is on the fire, which is upon the altar. and his inwards and his legs shall be washed in water, and the priest shall burn all on the altar to be a burnt sacrifice, an offering made by fire of a sweet savor unto the Lord. And if his offering be of the flock, namely of the sheep or of the goats, for a burnt sacrifice, he shall bring it a male without blemish, and he shall kill it on the side of the altar northward before the Lord. And the priests, Aaron's sons, shall sprinkle his blood round about upon the altar, and he shall cut it into his pieces with his head and his fat. And the priest shall lay them in order on the wood that is on the fire, which is upon the altar. But he shall wash the inwards and legs with water, and the priest shall bring it all and burn it upon the altar. It is a burnt sacrifice, an offering made by fire of a sweet savor unto the Lord. And if the burnt sacrifice for his offering to the Lord be of fowls, then he shall bring his offering of turtle doves or of young pigeons, and the priest shall bring it upon unto the altar, and wring off his head, and burn it on the altar, and the blood thereof shall be wrung out at the side of the altar, and he shall pluck away his crop with his feathers, and cast it beside the altar on the east part by the place of the ashes. And he shall cleave it with wings thereof, but shall not divide it asunder. And the priest shall burn it upon the altar, upon the wood that is upon the fire. It is a burnt sacrifice, an offering made by fire of a sweet savor unto the Lord. Our lesson
Pastor Brown,
breakdown. Yes, ma'am.
will you explain what is meant by "and he shall pluck away his crop"?
Some believe there's that's a part of our lesson discussion as we get into it, but that believes that's the part. You know how most fowl have like something hanging under their neck, in the neck
Oh, yes.
area. Yeah, it's
Yes.
believed that that's the part that's going to be cut off also, to make sure that it's offered up and it's identified as a part of the offering.
Thank you.
But I'll say a little bit more about it as when we get to it.
Okay.
All righty. Very good.
Thank you.
And good evening to you, Mrs. Robinson.
Good evening
All right.
to everybody.
Yeah. All right. The first part of our lesson is an offering from the herd. Leviticus 1:3-9, preparing the animal and presenting the sacrifice. The second part is an offering from the flock, and that's the sheep and the goats. And so it's preparing the animal and then presenting the sacrifice. And then thirdly, an offering of birds, and it preparing the sacrifice and presenting the sacrifice. And so we talked about the qualifications and also the organization of the priesthood. Now we're looking at their responsibility and their job. The book of Leviticus is one of the 5 books collectively known as the Pentateuch. Traditionally, these 5 books are ascribed to Moses. The contents of the Pentateuch as a whole are best viewed as deriving originally from Moses and carrying his authority. This quarter's previous lessons taken from the book of Exodus emphasize that God would dwell with his people and receive their worship in the tabernacle. Leviticus contains the most thorough instruction on the proper forms and procedures for the worship of God. The name again, Leviticus, means for Levi. It is a directive, it's a guidebook for the priests. The where and the how for worship, the book's divine authority and purposes are emphasized from the start. Leviticus 1 through 2. These are the Lord's regulations and instructions for his people and how they must conduct themselves in relation to him. It's not your way, it's God's way. God has established a way that certain things should be done. And I know you say, well, that's Old Testament church. No, in the New Testament church, God has established a way that things should be done. But we've mixed it up with so much doctrine that is not biblical doctrine, but church doctrine and other things that we've almost lost sight of God's way and God's directive. Leviticus takes its name from the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Old Testament. The title reflects the fact that the book relates to the tasks of the Levites who assisted the priests in carrying out duties associated with worship at the tabernacle. Remember, as we said before and we say again, all priests were Levites, but not all Levites were priests. Some of them were attendants, supporters, gophers, if I can use that word without offending anybody. They did what the priests say do. They went where the priest said go. A key word in Leviticus is the word holy. Of its 600 plus occurrences in the Bible, more are found in the book of Leviticus, the word holy, than in any other book of the Bible. Holiness refers to a state of being set apart, including both ritual and ethical purity. The words, ye shall be holy, for I am holy, or for I, the Lord, your God, am holy. Let me read it like it's written. Ye shall be holy, for I, the Lord, your God, am holy, is from Leviticus 19:2. Are directed not only to all the people of ancient Israel, but to all of God's people through time, according to 1 Peter 1:15-16. With so much emphasis on Leviticus, on holiness, perhaps we might think that teaching on love would take a back seat and be stressed elsewhere. But one of the most often quoted Old Testament passages in the New Testament is Leviticus 19:18. Love thy neighbor as thyself. Jesus even cited this as one of the two greatest commandments. The first one is love the Lord thy God with all thy heart. And the second one is likened unto it, love thy neighbor as thyself. There were many offerings. The role of the Levitical priests and priesthood, of course, descended from Aaron, and they was responsible for offering sacrifices and maintaining the tabernacle, and then later they maintained the temple. I want to just give you a little list, not in our book, but of the types of sacrifices. First is what we're talking about tonight, and that is burnt offering. Burnt offering was a total offering symbolizing complete dedication to God, with the entire animal burned on the altar, with the exception of the hide, I guess I would call it, the outer skin of the sacrifice, be it a goat or sheep or even from the herd. Um, and the requirement of burnt offerings was they had to be spotless, perfect, if you will. So the burnt offering, the second type of offering was offered for unintentional sins, and it's called a sin offering, with the blood sprinkled on the altar and the fat burned, atoning for transgressions. The third type of sacrifice or offering was a peace offering, which was a voluntary offering, often involving a meal shared between the worshiper, the priest, and friends, expressing gratitude and fellowship with God. The fourth type of offering they offered up was a grain offering, which was an offering of flour and oil, symbolizing thanksgiving and a gift from the worshiper's harvest. And then finally, in our discussion, the fifth is called the guilt offering, offered for specific transgressions, particularly those involving holy things, with restitution and a ram as the sacrifices. The symbolic meaning, these sacrifices served as a reminder of God's grace and justice, highlighting the seriousness of sin and the need for atonement. Jesus and the sacrificial system, the Old Testament sacrificial system, with its emphasis on blood and atonement, foreshadowed the ultimate sacrifice of Jesus Christ, who offered himself as perfect and final atonement for sin. The book of Leviticus details the laws and procedures for these sacrifices, emphasizing the importance of holiness and purity in approaching God. So it was a part of their teaching. So as we move into our lesson, verses 3 through 9 of chapter 1 of Leviticus, an offering from the herd. Now, normally, the offerings reflected the status of the offerer, if you understand what I'm saying. Normally, if it was a person of means, they would bring something from the herd. Someone who was not as well off would bring a lamb, a sheep rather, or a goat. And then for those that were poor, and we'll talk about it a little bit more when we get there, they offered up the fowls, which were turtle doves and pigeons. And as you know, Mary and Joseph offered up turtle doves when they made their offering during the time that Jesus was being presented. In the verse just before this one, the Lord permitted that animal sacrifices could come from either a person's herd of cattle, a person's flock of sheep and goats. The verse before us narrows the focus specifically to that of a burnt offering that comes from the herd. The directive to sacrifice only animals without blemish is repeated in Deuteronomy 15:21. This command reflects a key distinction between profane and sacred things. It also emphasizes that God deserves the best of one's herd rather than the worst. Reminds me of the offering of Cain and Abel. Mm-hmm. Abel offered God the best, and Cain offered God what he wanted to. Leviticus 22:17-33 gives us extended warnings against unacceptable sacrifices. Centuries later, the prophet Malachi would charge God's people with violating this prohibition. Malachi 1 and 8, Malachi 1, 13 and 14. The added specification that the blemish-free sacrifice be male foreshadows the sacrifice of Jesus. That the sacrifice for the burnt offering had to be a male. He shall offer it on his own, of his own voluntary will at the door of the tabernacle. Can't nobody make you. Should nobody drive you. You ought to make this sacrifice on your own. And this is considered a considerable from the herd sacrifice. There's some discussion in this that to offer up a whole unblemished cow today could cost you as much as $3,000, which is a significant, of course, it wasn't worth that back in those days, but it implies a significant sacrifice. The Hebrew word translated of his own voluntary will occurs dozens of times in the Old Testament, 7 of those in the book of Leviticus. It may refer to something that is acceptable or pleasing from the point of view of the giver as from the point of view of the receiver. If you don't give it willingly, if you don't give it without being pressured to give it, it implies that it's something you want to do. And when the receiver knows it's something you want to do, it makes it easier to receive the gift. In the context of Leviticus, focus on proper sacrifices. The word refers to what is acceptable to God, what conforms to his requirements, what pleases him. The burnt offering could not be presented just anywhere the giver desired. The worshiper had to bring, the worshiper had to bring it to the place specifically designated for such a sacred purpose, the tabernacle. The Lord was to be worshiped on his terms and at the sole place designated for that purpose. He instituted strict penalties for performing sacrifices in other locations. You can read that in Leviticus 17, 1 through 4, or Leviticus 17, 8 through 9, or Deuteronomy 12, 11 through 14. And it reiterates the necessity of a centralized worship site. Anticipating the full or the future temple in Jerusalem, this requirement forced the Israelites to worship the Lord alone in a consistent way and prevented them from continuing their practice of sacrificing to devils. And so they had the opportunity. For an ancient Israelite, giving up a herd or the head of a cattle for a burnt offering was significant. Bearing the burdens of all these costs served as a gauge of commitment to something or someone. That's known as an opportunity cost, and it's an ideal gauge for measuring the level of your devotion to the kingdom of God, giving God something that means something to you. I heard David said when he wanted to sacrifice to God, he said, I will not give or offer up to God anything that don't cost me nothing. It shows my desire for the relationship. Verse 4, and he shall put his hand upon the head of the burnt offering. I believe that the he here is the priest. And it shall be accepted for him to make atonement for him. As the reader works through the procedure specified for the various types of sacrifices, several similarities are seen. The first is the instruction to put a hand upon the head of the offering. This is the first of a multi-step procedure. The placement of the hand symbolizes the person's submission of the animal as a sacrifice on the person's behalf. Commentary in Leviticus 1:9 below summarizes the entirety of the steps. Verse 5, and he shall kill the bullock before the Lord, and the priest Aaron's son shall bring the blood and sprinkle the blood about upon the altar that is by the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. As the procedure continues to the following steps, we have to wonder who did the hands' own work to kill the bullocks. The context implies that it was the one who had brought it, the animal to be sacrificed. After that, the priest Aaron's sons ordained took over to perform the rest of the task regarding it. But the truth is, Leviticus 14:19 through 20 mentions a priest who was to slaughter the animal. In any case, a priest had to be present. He should be the officiate. The use of blood as described functions as a mechanism of purification. It reinforced the principle of atonement, since, as the Lord later declared, the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you upon the altar to make an atonement for your souls. For it is in the blood, for it is the blood that maketh an atonement for the soul. That's Leviticus 17:11. Verse 6, and he shall flay the burnt offering and cut it into pieces. The next step was the removal. Flay means removal of the animal's hide. This might be either prior to the simultaneous with the cutting of the carcass into the pieces, both which speed up the burning process if the hide is removed. Leviticus 7:8 directed that the priest officiating at the burnt offering should receive the animal's hide. Presenting the sacrifice, verse 7, and the sons of Aaron the priest shall put fire upon the altar and lay the wood in order upon the fire. Only priests were allowed to carry out the act of sacrificing the animal prepared for the burnt offering. The phrase put fire upon the altar does not mean to start the fire, because the fire for this altar was to burn continuously. Leviticus 6, verses 9 through 13, Numbers 28, 1 through 8. The idea instead is to stoke the fire. That's when you stir it. That's when you cause the flames to come up again. Verse 8, and the priest Aaron's son shall lay the parts, the head and the fat in order upon the wood that is on the fire, which is upon the altar. And we see the specifics spelled out also in Exodus 29:13 and Leviticus 8:20 and Leviticus 9:13. Verse 9 here says, but his inwards and his legs shall he wash in water, and the priest shall burn all on the altar to be a burnt sacrifice, an offering made by fire of a sweet savor unto the Lord. I believe it's the willingness of the sacrificer. I believe it's the priest following the God-given directions. I believe that it is the purpose of the sacrifice, a total offering symbolizing complete dedication to God, that changes the odor of the sacrifice into a sweet aroma to God. This verse concludes the description of the ritual that began in Leviticus 1 and 4. The resulting smoke that creates a sweet savor unto the Lord, attributes a human characteristic, a sense of smell to God. Of course, this is an anthropomorphic language, even though God is a spirit. It's assigning man's senses to God. But what it's just implying is that it's pleasing to God. The scriptures speak of him as having physical characteristics. Here, the sense of smell depicts how the Lord was pleased with the burnt offering as presented in the manner set forth in the text. So, to summarize, the ritual involved these steps: place hands on the animal's head, slay the animal, splash animal blood against the sides of the altar, remove the hide from the carcass, dismember the carcass, stoke the altar fire, arrange wood on the altar, arrange the animal's body pieces and the fat on the altar, wash internal organs and legs, burn all except the hide to create smoke that's pleasing to the Lord. That's the offering from the herd. The next is the offering from the flock, and that's verses 10 through 13, preparing the animal. And if his offering be of the flocks, namely of the sheep or of the goats for a burnt sacrifice, he shall bring it a male without blemish. For this kind of offering, goats or sheep that were male without blemish were interchangeable with bullocks just discussed. We see male goats and sheep themselves as interchangeable for Passover in Exodus 12 and 5. Either goats or sheep were acceptable for peace offerings, with either male or female allowed. Either bullocks, male or female, goats, or female lambs are allowed for sin or trespass offering, depending on the nature of the sin. So the directives are given. The one element we dare not lose sight of is a requirement for an unblemished sacrificial animal. That requirement describes Jesus, upon whose perfection, praise God, our salvation depends. That standard must be ours, our priority. Verse 11 says, and he shall kill it on the side of the altar northward before the Lord, and the priests, Aaron's sons, shall sprinkle his blood round about upon the altar. Here, specific instruction was given as to where the animal was to be slain, on the side of the altar northward. Why this was required is not entirely clear, although it may have something to do with the fact that the tabernacle and the gateway into its courtyards face the east. This rationale may also combine in some way with a need to distinguish this offering from the one taken from the herd, other than the procedure at this point is the same. Verse 12, and he shall cut it into pieces with his head and his fat, and the priest shall lay them in order on the wood that is on the fire, which is upon the altar. Again, the procedure is the same as that designated for the offering of the herd representative. Presenting the sacrifice, verse 13, but he shall wash the inwards and the legs with water, and the priest shall bring it all and burn it upon the altar. It is a burnt sacrifice, an offering made by fire, and that fire becomes a sweet savor unto the Lord. Yet again, the procedure is same as with the herd, as with which was the bullock. Thirdly, an offering of birds, an offering of birds, preparing the sacrifice. If the burnt sacrifice for his offering to the Lord be of fowls, then he shall bring his offering of turtle doves or of young pigeons. This option for burnt offering was provided for people who could not afford to bring the aforementioned offering from the herd or from the flock. Such an option was also provided for women after childbirth who could not afford to offer a lamb for the burnt offering of purification. One may recall the sacrifice that Joseph and Mary offered following the birth of Jesus, the turtle doves. Verse 15, and the priest shall bring it unto the altar, wring off his neck or head, and burn it on the altar. And the blood thereof shall be wrung out at the side of the altar. The procedure for offering a bird as a burnt offering differed from that prescribed for offering from the herd or from the flock. When you compare Leviticus 5, 7 through 10, whereas the blood of the animals that was sacrificed was sprinkled around the altar of burnt offering, the bird's blood was to be wrung out on the side of the altar. Though the bird's blood would not be nearly as abundant as that of the other animals, the need to separate its blood from its body must be completed. Israelites were forbidden to eat blood. Verse 16 says, and he shall pluck away his crop with his feathers and cast it beside the altar on the east part by the place of the ashes. The meaning of a bird's flock, a crop, Mrs. Robinson, again, they say is not certain. It may refer to the pouch near the gullet of the throat, the crew, as a craw, as they call it, the craw, where the bird stores food temporarily before digestion. So another option is that it may refer to the lower intestines. Its removal may be compared to removing the intestines from the animal of the herd or the animal from the flock. So there's no total clarity as to what that referred to, but I'm sure that those that were making the offerings in that time, they understood what they were talking about. But to the best of our understanding, it could be where the craw is, where they would store food, or it could mean the intestines, those inner part. Amen. That's the liver and the gizzard and those parts that some people still eat. The place of ashes that was beside the altar seems to have been a temporary location for ashes. The ultimate destination for that refuse was outside of the camp, according to Leviticus 4 and 12 and Numbers 4 and 13, presenting the sacrifice, and he shall cleave it with wings thereof, but shall not divide it asunder. And the priest shall burn it upon the altar, upon the wood that is upon the altar. It is a burnt sacrifice, an offering made by fire of a sweet savor unto the Lord. Again, don't forget what makes it a sweet savor of the Lord. One, is given willingly. Two, in the case of the herd or the flock, it is unblemished. Three, they do it in obedience to God and the way God said that it should be done. And when things are done the way God said they should be done, and when you give to God willingly, it becomes a sweet aroma to God, a sincere, dedicated offering. Further instructions regarding the sacrifice of bird conclude this portion of our text. The anatomy of a bird is different from that of sheep and goats and bovines, which is herdmen or cattle. Thus, the sacrificial procedures was quite different. The priest was solely responsible for preparing and presenting the bird as a burnt offering, though not as monetarily valuable as something offered from the flock or the herd. This offering still produced a sweet savor unto the Lord. Whether the worshiper was well-to-do or impoverished made no difference to the Lord, who treats everyone alike. All you had to do was follow the God-given instructions, and your sacrifice, your offering would be accepted. As followers of Jesus, our duty is to offer to God not burnt sacrifices of animals or birds, but our lives as living sacrifices. According to Romans 12:1, our sacrifices do include the monetary gifts that God has blessed us with. Hebrews 13:16, 2 Corinthians 8:3-4, Philippians 4:18, but are primarily spiritual. 1 Peter 2:5, consisting of the fruit of our lips, offering our thanks to God. Hebrews 13:15, and the good deeds we do as salt and light in our sphere of influence, according to Matthew 5:13-14. Finally, the burnt offerings in the first is the first of several kinds of sacrifices in the book of Leviticus. I named most of them to you. The burnt offering is mentioned first, perhaps because it was the most committal. The one presenting the sacrifice received nothing tangible back. You didn't get no choice piece of meat. Everything was burnt up as a complete sacrifice to God, again, symbolizing complete dedication to God. Deuteronomy 12:27 would seem to contradict that statement, but this exception applied to Israelites who lived too far from the tabernacle to make the trip therein. There was exception. Burnt offerings are mentioned about 270 times in the Old Testament. Their association with atonement makes study of them important in light of New Testament passages such as Mark 12:33 and Hebrews 10:1-14. The smell of worship. One day in a class I was teaching, we discussed the sacrifice the Israelites were required to bring as part of their worship of the Lord. Someone asked, how did those people stand the smell of all of those animals being burned up day after day? To our modern way of thinking, the sacrificial system prescribed in the Old Testament and covered in today's text may seem odd, wasteful, the killing of all those animals, and even offensive. And as mentioned earlier, the book of Leviticus does not make for the most captivating reading in the world. Whatever ugliness we may see or discuss, we may feel about the sacrificial system with all its bloodshed and the continual smell coming from the sacrifices being offered. God saw things differently. The sacrificial offerings constituted, as our lesson title states, a sweet aroma unto God. This is why it is so important to allow him to dictate what kind of worship is acceptable to him. Through the sacrificial system, God demonstrated the necessity of total commitment to him, his desire to be present with his people, and the seriousness of sin. Blood had to be shed for the cause of sin. He wanted people to understand that, as Paul puts it in Romans 6:23, the wages of sin is death. But God, in his grace, has always provided a substitute so that we do not have to pay those wages. In the Old Testament system, the substitutes were the animals of birds. Those substitutes foreshadowed the ultimate substitute who God in time would provide. Jesus, whose sacrifice at the cross was also a sweet smelling savor, right there in Ephesians 5:2. The once for all sacrifice that fulfill what and who the Old Testament sacrifices pointed toward. Indeed, as Paul puts it, our lives are to serve as a sweet savor of Christ, spreading the savor of his knowledge everywhere we go. I thought to remember, always worship God on his terms, not ours. A
Yeah.
sweet aroma unto God. Did that sort of answer your question, Mrs. Robinson?
Yes, it did. Thank you so much.
All right, very good. Thank you. And thank you all for being here tonight. Miss Pam, we're in your hands.
Do it for me. You ought to look at your neighbor and tell your neighbor, I want